For the longest time, I've had a bunch of games in my Steam library that looked neat, but I never got around to playing. When I finally did get around to playing a few of them a couple of years ago, one stuck out to me, and I kept playing it through to completion unlike all the rest. Following the inspiration from Shadow of the Colossus, Dark Souls, and The Legend of Zelda, Titan Souls takes on the challenge of making a game that focuses on tough boss fights that you need to master understanding and the patterns of to beat. Mark Foster and David Fenn managed to pull this off to a degree that carries its own community of fans who follow into their new work that they design with what they've learned from this game. This game marks the start of the indie group Acid Nerve. The combat in Titan Souls is pretty simple. The only mechanics you need controls for are the bow and the roll. With only one control for evasion and one control for attack, it helps a lot when you figure out what went wrong in the previous fight, as you just need to figure out how you'd have utilized either of the two mechanics, taking a load off your mind during the stressful fights that the game throws at you. Something else that's simplified is the health. Instead of having any health bars, both you and the boss have one hit point. Though for the boss you can't hit them unless it's their vulnerable spot. But one hit point adds a lot of interesting things to the table. Firstly, when you lose, neither you or the boss will lose an advantage or a disadvantage in a fight. Re-entering the boss fight is like picking up from where you left off, for most of the fights at least, since neither of you had any more or less health than you started with. Another thing is that fights don't really last long. You can focus on evading to see more of what the boss can do, but it's very unforgiving when you take a shot at a bad time. Having only one hit point keeps you on the edge of your seat for the whole fight. In only one move, either you or the boss could win. This factor also made it popular with the speedrunning community, as they look for the shortest method for getting that one hit. With no abilities unlocked, all of the progression comes from getting comfortable with the game and its bosses. With only one hit point, large empty areas to wander around, and simple controls, the game could easily get tedious and monotonous if the bosses don't have major variations into changing your thinking for each fight. Luckily, the bosses and their rooms are wildly different in each fight. One fight you're going against an electrical serpent, you need to get to the little islands to get out of its way. Another fight, you need to lure a cube into a position where your arrow can go right into it. There are a lot of boss fights that feel more like fast-paced puzzles than boss fights, and they all to me feel like they're more mini-games than boss fights in their variation. Despite a lot of the positive things I've said about the game, it's not perfect. There aren't a lot of problems, but they're really common and occurring frustrating ones. One of which is the time between fights, which you'd think would be more refined with how focused the game is on boss fights. When you die in a fight, the game takes a while to fade out to your last checkpoint. Then, with that transition, in addition, with the walk back to the boss room. It takes a lot more time when it adds up for each death. The game only puts emphasis on how long this is, with how quick the boss fights can be. With the game being unforgiving, some fights just feel like a complete waste of time. At least 50% of the negative reviews of the game mention this. The other 50% mention the problem with the one hit the game uses in such interesting ways. With the one hit point comes a lot of difficulty of properly balancing out boss fights to not be too hard and not be too easy, which a lot of the bosses fall into the trap of. Games with health have an easier time being balanced, as you can change how much the bosses have and how much damage different attacks do. This problem affects a lot of people and is prevalent when one of the first 4 boss fights that are mandatory are one of the most difficult, keeping a lot of players from continuing to play after that point. The game devs have stated that their game's story is up to interpretation, but a lot of the art and bosses take inspiration from Judaism and the association to Jewish mythology, which doesn't receive enough representation for how interestingly it can be interpreted into video games. Games with an interpretable story can form a community who try to interpret it and have interesting discussions about authorial intent. Despite what I said about the large spaces being empty and adding to the tedium for a lot of people, I actually really like it and its beautiful environmental art, since it's filled with inscriptions hinting at pieces of plot. One of the titans you slay are called the Elder, and talk to you as you climb up and take their soul, and talks about how heavy of a toll you've paid for the abomination in your quiver. And some inscriptions hint towards the process of creating an arrow that can kill a titan. Then, one of the titans is someone else with an arrow as well, Elhanan, which has the same name as one of the people in the mythology of David and Goliath who had debated to have killed Goliath in the story. Then there's also a lot of golems that represent different things. A lot of cool stuff there. The final thing you fight before the final boss is the Soul, who takes on your appearance, and then once you beat them, you move on to fighting Truth. They take on the appearance of an angel and have 3 stages. I think they're very interesting and have a lot to dissect about each stage, but here's the final scene when you beat the final boss. Here's the flowchart for the sort of game loop that you have when you play the game. So yeah, you start, you explore the environment, you find boss rooms, and you challenge the boss. And then you keep going in circles with losing and fighting the boss, and then maybe you win and go back to exploring to find more boss rooms.